It started with a little girl complaining of a stomach ache. Most folks would have called it nothing, a bug, maybe nerves. But sometimes, child, what's hurting on the inside ain't just sickness. It's silence. And this silence nearly cost her life, till the people who loved her found the courage to speak up. Before we dive into this, hit the subscribe button and tell us from where in the world you're watching from. Leah Monroe was one of those children who carried sunlight in her pockets. 8 years old, with hair the color of autumn wheat and a laugh. Lord, that laugh was like wind chimes dancing in a summer breeze. She had her grandmother's eyes deep, brown, the kind that seemed to hold all the world's wisdom, even in such a young face. But if you looked close, real close, the way only grandmothers and teachers know how to look, you'd see them shadows under those beautiful eyes. Dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights and pain that had no name. You'd see the way she'd clutch her belly when she thought no one was watching. Little hands pressed against her stomach like she was trying to hold something inside from breaking. Freed her grandmother, Mary. Now there was a woman who loved with her whole spine. 63 years old, with silver hair braided down her back, and hands that had known more work than most folks see in 2 lifetimes. She'd raised 4 children of her own, buried a husband too young, and now found herself caring for this precious child while her son Jason worked double shifts at the factory. Mary knew pain when she saw it. She'd carried enough of her own. Leah, baby, she'd whisper on those nights, when the child couldn't sleep, when tiny whimpers escaped despite her best. Efforts to be brave. Tell Grandma where it hurts. But Leah had learned the Monroe family language early. Silence in the face of suffering. Pride dressed up as strength. Her daddy, Jason, he'd look at those tear-filled eyes and say, "You're tough, little girl." Monroe's. Don't quit over a little stomach ache. Jason Monroe wasn't a bad man. Lord knows I ain't here to judge the heart of a father trying his best. But he was a man who mistook silence for strength, who thought love meant teaching a child to swallow her pain like bitter medicine. He'd grown up in a house where showing hurt was weakness, where men worked until they dropped and children learned not to complain. When Leah would double over during breakfast, tears streaming down her cheeks, Jason would kneel down and say, "Pain's just weakness leaving the body, sweetheart. You're stronger than this." But pain don't care about last names. And it sure don't care about pride. Funny thing about suffering, ... it waits. It's patient as a snake in summer grass. And while that family was busy pretending everything was fine, while Jason convinced himself his daughter just needed to toughen up, while Mary whispered prayers into the darkness, Leah's little body was keeping score. Every missed meal because her stomach hurt too much to eat. Every night she spent curled in a ball, trying to make herself small enough that maybe the pain couldn't find her. Every morning she woke up hoping today would be different. Today the ache would be gone. But hope's a fragile thing in the hands of a child who's learned not to ask for help. Spring came late that year, and with it, a restlessness in little Leah that Mary couldn't quite name. The child had always been thin, but now her clothes hung on her like she was borrowing from an older sister. Her appetite, never robust, dwindled to almost nothing. "She's just going through a phase," Jason would say when Mary brought up her concerns. "Kids go through growth spurts. She eat when she's hungry." But Mary had raised children. She knew the difference between a picky eater and a child whose body was rejecting nourishment. She knew the look of a child fighting a battle too big for her small frame. It was Miss Emily Hayes who first saw what the family had been too close to recognize. Emily was 26, fresh out of college with idealism still shining in her eyes, and a heart bigger than her experience. She'd been teaching 3rd grade for only 2 years, but she had that gift some folks are born with, the ability to see children, really see them, past the masks they learn to wear so young. Leah had always been a good student, quiet, careful with her work, never causing trouble. But lately, Emily noticed the little girl seemed to fade a little more each day, like someone was slowly turning down the brightness on her spirit. Leah, Emily said one afternoon, kneeling beside the child's desk. You haven't touched your lunch again. Leah looked up with those old soul eyes. My tummy hurts, Miss Hayes. For how long, sweetheart? The child considered this with the seriousness of someone much older. A long time. But Daddy, says Monrose, are tough. Something cold settled in Emily's chest. She'd been a teacher long enough to recognize the sound of adult words in a child's mouth. Words that didn't quite fit, like wearing shoes too big. That's when Emily started paying closer attention. She noticed how Leah would press her small hands against her abdomen during reading time. How she'd excuse herself to the bathroom more, and more frequently, returning with red-rimmed eyes and a pallor that spoke of nausea and worse. She noticed how the little girl had started sitting differently, leaning to one side, as if something inside was pushing against her ribs. And then came that Tuesday in early April. The morning started ordinary enough. Spring sunshine streaming through classroom windows, children chattering about weekend adventures, the usual rhythm of elementary school life. Leah was at her desk, bent over a math worksheet, when Emily heard it. Not a cry, not a scream, just ... Silence where there should have been the scratch of pencil on paper. Emily looked up from her lesson plan to see Leah slumped forward, her small body folded over her desk like a broken flower. Not the usual untired slump that teachers know well. This was different. This was the boneless collapse of a child whose body had finally said enough. Leah? Emily's voice cut through the classroom chatter, bringing 23 other children to sudden stillness. No response. Emily crossed the room in 3 quick strides, her teacher instincts kicking in. She placed a gentle hand on Leah's back and felt the child's breathing shallow, rapid, like a bird with a broken wing. Leah, honey, can you hear me? The little girl stirred, lifted her head slightly. Her face was the color of old parchment, beaded with sweat despite the cool morning air. It hurts, she whispered, so quietly Emily had to lean close to hear. It really, really hurts. And that's when Emily made the decision that would change everything. She gently helped Leah sit back in her chair and, with the practiced care of someone who'd tended to countless childhood scraped knees and upset stomachs, she lifted the edge of the child's school uniform shirt. What she found there, ... Lord, have mercy, ... What she found there made her hands shake like leaves in a storm. Leah's belly was swollen tight as a drum, distended in a way that made Emily's teacher training scream warnings. But it wasn't just the swelling. It was the network of bruises not the accidental kind children collect like badges of honor, but deep, mottled marks that spoke of internal battles being fought in that small body. And underneath it all, Emily could see something else. A mass hard and unyielding, pushing against the child's thin skin like some alien thing trying to break free. In that moment, standing in her cheerful 3rd grade classroom with 23 pairs of young eyes watching, Emily Hayes made a choice that would unravel everything. She reached for her phone and dialed 911 because when she made that call, she didn't just summon an ambulance. She called the wolves to the door. What came next was a war fought on 3 fronts, each battle as fierce as the last. There was Leah, 8 years old, and fighting a body that had turned traitor. A body that should have been running and laughing and climbing trees, instead hosting something dark and hungry that fed on her childhood. There was Mary, fighting her son's stubborn pride with every weapon in a grandmother's arsenal tears, pleas, and finally, the kind of righteous anger that can move mountains when a child's life hangs in the balance. And there was Miss Emily Hayes, fighting a clock that ticked louder with every passing second, knowing that sometimes the difference between tragedy and miracle is measured in heartbeats. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but to Emily, it felt like hours. She held Leia's small hand while they worked, whispering reassurances that tasted like lies on her tongue. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. These nice people are going to help you feel better." But Leia's eyes, those wise, old eyes and such, a young face seemed to see right through the comfort to the fear beneath. "Am I going to die, Miss Hayes?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. "How do you answer that? How do you look into the face of a child who's carried pain for so long she's forgotten what it feels like to be whole, and promise her everything will be all right when you don't know if it will?" "You're going to fight," Emily said, squeezing that tiny hand, "and we're all going to fight with you." They called Mary first. She arrived at the hospital like a woman possessed, silver hair wild from running, still wearing the flour-dusted apron she'd been cooking in when the phone rang. Behind her came Jason, called away from his shift at the factory, his face a mask of confusion and growing dread. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice carrying the edge of a man who'd built his whole identity on being in control. "She was fine this morning. Kids get stomach aches all the time." But Mary ... Mary took one look at her granddaughter lying on that hospital gurney, 4 tubes snaking from her small arms, monitors tracking every labored breath, and she knew. "Jason Michael Monroe," she said, using the tone that had straightened the spines of 4 children and countless grandchildren. "That child has been telling us she was hurting for months. Months. And you kept saying she needed to toughen up. I was teaching her to be strong. You were teaching her that her pain didn't matter." The doctor who came to speak with them was a woman in her 40s, Dr. Sarah Chun, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of gentle competence that made you trust her with your life. But even she couldn't soften what they needed to hear. "We need to run some tests," she said, her voice professionally calm. "The swelling in Leia's abdomen is significant, and we need to understand what's causing it." Jason's face went white. "Causing what?" "It's just a stomach ache. Kids get stomach aches." Dr. Chun looked at him with the patience of someone who'd delivered difficult news too many times to count. "Mr. Monroe, your daughter is very sick. We're going to do everything we can, but I need you to understand this isn't something that developed overnight." And that's when the real war began. Not the battle for Leia's life that would come later, fought in operating rooms and recovery wards. This was the battle for her father's soul. Jason Monroe had been raised by a father who believed showing weakness was the gravest sin a man could commit. He'd learned to bury pain so deep it became part of his foundation. When his wife Sarah had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, he'd held his tears until he was alone, then wept just once before, locking that grief away where it couldn't touch him. He'd taught his daughter the same lesson. Pain was temporary. Strength was forever. Monroe's endured. But sitting in that hospital waiting room, watching his little girl disappear behind a wall of medical equipment and worried faces, Jason began to understand that some lessons do more harm than healing. Mary sat beside him, her weathered hands clutching a rosary worn smooth by decades of prayer. "She tried to tell us," she whispered. "All those nights she couldn't sleep. All those mornings she couldn't eat. She tried to tell us, and we told her to be strong instead of listening. The tests came back like hammer blows. Court scans that showed shadows where there should be light. Blood work that painted a picture no parent should ever have to see. Ultrasounds that revealed the truth they'd all been running from. Leia had a tumor, a mass the size of a grapefruit growing in her small abdomen, pressing against organs that were never meant to accommodate such an unwelcome guest. It was why she couldn't eat, why she couldn't sleep, Why every day had become a battle just to exist. Is it? Jason couldn't finish the question. The word cancer stuck in his throat, like a stone. We won't know until we operate, Dr. Chon said gently. But Mr. Monroe, Mrs. Monroe, I need you to understand. This has been growing for some time. Months, possibly longer. If we'd caught it earlier, ... double quotes, she didn't need to finish. The weight of those unspoken words settled over them like a shroud. That night, Jason sat beside his daughter's hospital bed, watching her sleep fitfully under the harsh fluorescent lights. She looked so small, so fragile, dwarfed by the medical equipment that beeped and hummed around her. He thought about all the times she'd come to him in tears, holding her stomach. All the times he'd told her to be tough, to push through, to be a Monroe. He thought about his own father, a man who'd worked himself to death rather than admit he was hurting. And for the first time in 3 years, Jason Monroe wept. Not the single, controlled tear he'd allowed himself at Sarah's funeral. These were the tears of a man whose pride had finally cracked, letting in the light that revealed all the damage she'd done in the name of strength. Mary found him there in the morning, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the weight of understanding. "She's going to hate me," he said without looking up. Mary sat down beside him, her own eyes red from a sleepless night. "No, son, she's going to forgive you, because that's what children do. They forgive us even when we don't deserve it. The question is ... can you forgive yourself? There's something about hospital walls that makes truth-telling easier. Maybe it's the way they strip away all the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about being in control. Maybe it's the smell of antiseptic that cleans more than just surfaces. It seems to wash away the pretenses we use to protect our hearts. Or maybe it's the way a child's pain as if cutting through all the adult nonsense, straight to what matters. The morning before Leia's surgery, she was awake early, watching the sunrise paint her hospital room in shades of gold and pink. Jason had spent the night in the chair beside her bed, and she'd been studying his sleeping face with the serious attention children reserved for understanding the adults. "Who shaped their world, Daddy?" she said softly when she saw his eyes flutter. "Open, I'm here, baby girl." His voice was rough with sleep and unshed tears. "Are you sad because I'm sick? How do you explain to an 8-year-old that your sadness runs deeper than her illness? That it reaches back through months of dismissed pain, through years of learned hardness, through generations of men who confused strength with silence?" "I'm sad because I didn't listen," Jason said finally, the words scraping his throat raw. "When you told me you were hurting, I didn't listen." Leia considered this with the gravity of someone much older. "Were you scared?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Scared? He'd been terrified. Terrified of doctors and bills and words like tumor and surgery. Terrified of admitting his daughter might need something he couldn't provide. Terrified of seeming weak, of failing to be the rock his family needed. "Yeah, baby. I was scared." "Me too," she whispered, and reached for his hand with fingers so small they almost disappeared in his calloused palm. "But Grandma Mary says being scared is okay. She says brave people are scared too. They just do what needs doing anyway." That's when the last of Jason's walls came tumbling down. Not with a crash, but with the gentle persistence of water wearing away stone. His little girl, facing surgery that could save or destroy her, was comforting him. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words carried the weight of every dismissed tear, every ignored plea for help. "I'm so sorry, Leia." She squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "It's okay, Daddy. You're listening now." Mary arrived an hour later to find them like that father and daughter, hands clasped, talking quietly about everything and nothing. About the birds outside the window and whether heaven had playgrounds. About how much they missed Mommy Sarah and whether she was watching over them. About how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you need help. "The doctor wants to see us," Mary said softly, not wanting to break the spell of honesty that had settled over the room. Dr. Chun was waiting in her office, her face carefully neutral in the way medical professionals learn to master. On her desk were scans and charts and test results that would determine the shape of their future. "The tumor is large," she began without preamble, "but the good news is that the blood work suggests it's likely benign, not cancerous. However, its size and location make the surgery complicated." Jason felt his knees go weak with relief and terror in equal measure. Not cancer, but complicated surgery. On his 8-year-old daughter. What are the risks? Mary asked, ever practical even in crisis. Dr. Chun's honesty was both brutal and kind. "There's always risk with any surgery, especially one this extensive. But Leia is young and, despite everything, relatively strong. The bigger concern is the delay." She turned the computer screen toward them, showing images that looked like alien landscapes, the geography of his daughter's pain mapped in black and white. "This has been growing for quite some time. The pressure it's putting on her other organs. If we'd caught it 6 months ago, this would have been a much simpler procedure." Jason stared at those images, proof of his failure, written in medical terminology and shadows on X-rays. 6 months ago, Leia had first started complaining about stomach pain. 6 months of telling her to be tough, to push through, to stop making such a fuss. "It's my fault," he said, the words falling like stones into still water. "Mr. Monroe," Dr. Chun said gently, "guilt won't help your daughter now. What will help is making sure she knows she's loved and supported, whatever comes next." But Mary, wise in the way that comes from decades of loving imperfect people, placed her hand on her son's shoulder. "Jason, honey, we can't change what's been. We can only love forward from here. Love forward." The phrase settled into Jason's chest like a prayer, like a promise, like the first line of a song he was just learning to sing. That afternoon, while Leia napped, Jason walked the hospital corridors with the restless energy of a man trying to outpace his own thoughts. He found himself in the chapel, a small, quiet room with simple wooden benches and a stained glass window that painted rainbow shadows on the floor. He wasn't much for praying. Hadn't been since Sarah died, if he was honest. But sitting there, in the colored light, he found words rising from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "I don't know if you're listening," he said to the silence. "I don't know if I deserve to ask for anything, but she does. Leia deserves everything good this world has to offer. So if you're taking requests, don't let my mistakes cost her everything." He might have stayed there longer, working through years of suppressed emotion, but a small voice interrupted his prayer. "Daddy?" He turned to find Leia standing in the chapel doorway, dragging her 4-pole behind her like a mechanical companion. She was supposed to be sleeping, but hospital beds aren't made for 8-year-olds who've suddenly discovered their fathers are human. "What are you doing, baby girl?" "Looking for you," she said simply, and climbed onto the bench beside him. "Are you talking to Mommy?" Jason's throat tightened. "Maybe. Would that be okay?" Leia nodded solemnly. "Will you tell her I miss her, and that I'm sorry I'm sick?" "Oh, sweetheart, none of this is your fault. Not one bit of it." "Then why does it hurt so much?" Long pause, a sound of wind through stained glass. It was, perhaps, the most honest question anyone had ever asked him. Why does it hurt so much? Not just the tumor, not just the physical pain, but all of it? The loss, the fear, the crushing weight of loving someone more than your own life and not knowing how to protect them. "I don't know," he said finally. "I used to think I knew. I used to think if we were just tough enough, strong enough, we could keep the hurt away. But maybe Maybe the hurt is part of loving. Maybe it means we care enough to feel it. Leia leaned against his shoulder, small and warm and alive. I love you, Daddy, even when it hurts. I love you too, baby girl, more than all the stars in the sky. They sat together in the colored light, father and daughter, learning new ways to be brave. Learning that strength isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to love despite it. Learning that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is let someone see you scared tomorrow would bring surgery. Uncertainty, the terrible gamble of placing your child's life in the hands of surgeons and hope. But today, in this moment, they had each other and the slowly dawning understanding that love doesn't require perfection. It only requires presence. Surgery was scheduled for dawn. Not because dawn held any medical significance, but because Dr. Shun knew that waiting was its own kind of torture, and parents who'd spent the night watching their child sleep would need morning light to face what came next. Jason hadn't slept. Neither had Mary. They'd taken turns sitting beside Leia's bed, memorizing the sound of her breathing, the curve of her cheek against the pillow, the way her small hand curled around the stuffed elephant Emily Hayes had brought. From the classroom. At 5 a.m., the preoperative team arrived like a gentle army. Nurses with kind eyes and steady hands. An anesthesiologist who spoke to Leia like she was the most important person in the world. Orderlies who moved with the quiet efficiency of people who understood they were handling someone's everything. Can I take Eddie with me? Leia asked, clutching the stuffed elephant. Of course, sweetheart, said the nurse, a woman whose own children were grown, but who still carried mother love in her voice. Eddie looks like he's very brave. We'll need brave helpers today. There's a sound a man makes when his pride finally breaks completely. Not cracks, not bends, but shatters like glass hitting concrete. Jason Monroe made that sound in the hospital corridor as they wheeled his daughter toward the operating room. One sob ripped from his chest like a root torn from dry earth, raw and ugly and completely honest. And then he ran after the gurney, catching up just as they reached the doors marked authorized personnel only. Leia, he called, his voice rough with everything he'd never learned to say. She turned her head toward him, those wise eyes bright with medication but still completely focused on her father. What is it, Daddy? You don't have to be tough anymore, okay? You don't have to be strong. You just have to be you. That's enough. You're enough. A smile spread across her face like sunrise. I know, Daddy. You taught me that. The waiting began then. 3 hours, the doctor had said. 3 hours to remove what shouldn't be there, to give Leia back the childhood that had been slowly stolen by something growing in the dark. Mary sat in the surgical waiting room, rosary beads clicking softly through her fingers, lips moving. In prayers worn smooth by repetition, Jason paced like a caged animal, unable to sit still, unable to think about anything except what was happening behind those closed doors. She's going to be fine, Mary said for the dozenth time as much, to convince herself as to comfort her son. What if she's not? Jason's voice was barely a whisper. What if I waited too long? What if... Stop. Mary's voice cut through his spiral of guilt like a blade. Just stop. We're here now. She's getting the help she needs now. That's what matters. Emily Hayes arrived at hour 2, still wearing yesterday's clothes and carrying a bouquet of sunflowers. That seemed to bring actual sunshine into the sterile waiting room. Any word? She asked, settling into a chair beside Mary. Still waiting, Jason said, and meant so much more than just the surgery. Emily studied his face, the red-rimmed eyes, the stubble, the way his hands shook slightly when he thought no one was looking. This wasn't the same man who'd dismissed his daughter's pain for months. This was someone who'd been broken open and was still figuring out how to exist in the aftermath. She's lucky to have you, Emily said quietly. Jason's laugh was bitter, as black coffee. Lucky? I almost killed her with my stubbornness, but you didn't. Emily's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent years watching children navigate difficult adults. You learned. You changed, and she saw that. That's what she remembered. Not that you made mistakes, but that you loved her enough to change. At hour 2 and 47 minutes, Jason found himself back in the hospital chapel. Not to pray this time, but to sit in the colored light and try to make sense of how completely his world had shifted in less than 24 hours. He thought about Sarah, about how she'd always been the one to tend scraped knees and comfort nightmares. How he'd convinced himself that being the strong one meant never admitting uncertainty. How his definition of strength had nearly cost him everything that mattered. I'm learning, he said to the stained glass saints, to Sarah's memory, to whoever might be listening. I'm learning how to love without armor. I'm learning that being strong sometimes means being soft. I'm learning I don't know anything, but I want to do better. At hour 3 and 12 minutes, Dr. Chun appeared in the waiting room doorway, still in her surgical scrubs, her face carefully controlled in that way doctors learn when they carry other people's hearts in their hands. Jason's knees nearly buckled. Mary clutched her rosary so tightly the beads left impressions in her palm. Emily held her breath. The surgery was successful, Dr. Chun said, and the words hit the room like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. We were able to remove the entire tumor. It was indeed benign, and while recovery will take time, I expect Leia to make a full recovery. Jason collapsed into the nearest chair, his body finally releasing tension it had carried for hours, for months, for years. Mary wept openly, tears of relief and gratitude streaming down her weathered cheeks. Emily smiled so widely it seemed to light up the entire room. Can we see her? Jason asked, his voice rough with emotion. She's in recovery now. Still groggy from anesthesia, but she's awake and asking for her daddy. They found her in a room filled with balloons and cards from her classmates, looking impossibly small in the hospital bed, but with color in her cheeks for the first time in months. Her eyes fluttered open when she heard their footsteps. Daddy? Her voice was weak but clear. Is it gone? Jason took her small hand in both of his, marveling at how something so delicate could be so strong. It's gone, baby girl. All gone. Does that mean my tummy won't hurt anymore? That's exactly what it means. Leia smiled, the first completely pain-free smile Jason had seen from her in longer than he could remember. Good. I was getting tired of hurting. Over the next few days, as Leia grew stronger, and the hospital room filled with flowers and stuffed animals and drawings from her classmates, Jason began to understand what recovery meant, not just for his daughter, but for their entire family. It meant learning to listen when someone said they were in pain. It meant understanding that strength comes in many forms, and sometimes the strongest thing you can do is ask for help. It meant discovering that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the birthplace of connection, of healing, of love. On the day Leia was discharged, she walked out of the hospital holding Jason's hand, her steps a little unsteady, but her smile brighter than the spring sunshine. Mary walked beside them, tears of joy making tracks down her cheeks, while Emily followed with a wagon full of flowers and well wishes from Leia's classmates. Where do you want to go first? Jason asked as they reached the parking lot. Leia considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important decisions. Home, she said finally. But can we stop and get ice cream? My tummy feels like it has room for ice cream now. And so they did. They stopped at the little ice cream shop on Maple Street, where Leia ordered the biggest sundae on the menu and ate every bite without a single complaint of stomach pain. Jason watched her eat with the wonder of someone witnessing a miracle, which, he supposed, he was. That night, After Leia was tucked into her own bed, surrounded by familiar things, Jason sat on her bedroom floor, putting together a puzzle. A peaceful scene of sunflowers against a blue sky that Emily had brought as a welcome home gift. "Daddy?" Leia's voice was sleepy but content. "What is it, sweetheart?" "I'm glad I got sick." The words hit him like a physical blow. "Leia, honey, why would you say that?" "Because now you know how to hear me when I hurt. And now I know you love me, even when I'm not being tough." Jason set down the puzzle piece he was holding and looked at his daughter, really looked at her. 8 years old and already understanding truths it had taken him 35 years to learn. "You're right," he said softly, "but I wish I'd learned it without you having to hurt so much first." "Maybe that's just how learning works sometimes," she said with the wisdom that children sometimes carry like gifts. "Maybe we have to go through the dark to find the light." He finished the puzzle that night, piece by piece, while Leia drifted off to sleep. The sunflowers came together slowly, each piece finding its place in the larger picture, until what had seemed impossible became beautiful and whole. Just like his family. 2 months later, on a Saturday morning when the world smelled like possibility and fresh-cut grass, they planted sunflowers in the backyard. Leia, Mary, and Jason, 3 generations kneeling in the dirt, hands learning how to nurture instead of just endure. The scar on Leia's belly was healing pink and clean, a reminder not of pain but of courage. She wore it like a badge of honor now, this mark that said she'd fought something bigger than herself and won. "How deep should they go, Daddy?" Leia asked, holding a handful of seeds that looked impossibly small for what they would become. "Deep enough to take root," Jason said, and meant so much more than gardening. "But not so deep they can't find the light." Mary smiled, her weathered hands gentle with the earth. "Sunflowers are special flowers," she told Leia. "They don't just grow toward the sun. They follow it across the sky all day long. They never stop reaching for the light." Leia considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important information. "Like us?" "Like us," Jason agreed. His voice thick with understanding. Emily Hayes joined them that afternoon, bringing lemonade and the kind of easy laughter that had become a regular part of their lives. She'd become more than Leia's teacher. She'd become family in the way that sometimes happens when people walk through fire together and come out holding hands. "How are you feeling, sunshine?" Emily asked, settling cross-legged beside Leia in the garden. "Strong," Leia said without hesitation, "but the good kind of strong. The kind where you can still cry when you need to." Emily and Jason exchanged a look over Leia's head, a look that said, "This child is going to change the world, and we get to watch it happen." The sunflowers grew tall that summer, taller than anyone expected. By July, they towered over the fence, their faces bright as joy, following the sun's path with the patience of things that understand their purpose. Leia grew too, not just physically, though the healthy appetite that had returned after surgery was adding needed weight to her small frame. She grew in confidence, in the knowledge that her voice mattered, that her pain was worthy of attention. That love didn't require perfection. Jason found himself a different man than he'd been 6 months earlier. The walls he'd built around his heart hadn't just cracked, they'd been demolished, and in their place, something green and growing had taken root. He learned to say, "I'm sorry," and mean it. He learned to say, "I don't know," without shame. He learned to say, "I love you," like it was the most important words in any language. Most importantly, he learned to listen. One evening in late August, as the sunflowers nodded heavy with seeds and the air carried the promise of autumn, Leia came to him with that serious expression that meant important thoughts were brewing. "Daddy, I want to tell you something." Jason set down the book he'd been reading, a story about gardens and second chances that Emily had recommended, and gave Leia his full attention. "What is it, sweetheart?" I forgive you, she said simply, for not listening before. I forgive you. The words hit him like benediction, like absolution, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. He'd been carrying guilt like stones in his pockets, the weight of every dismissed tear, every ignored plea for help. But children, it turns out, are natural healers. They forgive not because you deserve it, but because love is stronger than mistakes. Thank you, he whispered, pulling her into a hug that tried to communicate all the gratitude and wonder and fierce love he couldn't put into words. Besides, Leia said, her voice muffled against his shoulder, if you hadn't learned to listen, maybe other daddies wouldn't learn either. Maybe other kids would hurt like I hurt. And there it was, the truth that had been growing alongside the sunflowers all summer. This wasn't just their story. It was a story about every parent who'd ever mistaken toughness for love, every child who'd ever swallowed pain to please the adults in their world, every family learning that strength comes in many forms. Jason started speaking at schools after that, not because he wanted to, but because Leia asked him to. He'd stand in front of rooms full of parents and teachers, his hands shaking like autumn leaves, and tell them about nearly losing everything because he was too proud to listen. Your children are trying to tell you things, he'd say, his voice growing stronger with each word. They're trying to tell you when they hurt, when they're scared, when they need help. And the bravest thing you can do, the strongest thing you can do, is listen. He'd tell them about sunflowers then, about how they turn their faces toward the light, no matter how dark the soil beneath them. About how sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the deepest pain. About how love isn't about being perfect, it's about being present. Mary would sit in the back of those rooms, her silver hair catching the light, pride and love shining in her eyes. She'd watched her son transform from a man afraid of vulnerability into someone who wore his heart like armor, not to protect himself, but to protect others. Emily would be there too, sometimes grading papers in the back row, but listening to every word. She'd seen the miracle up close, not just Leia's physical healing, but the healing of an entire family, learning new ways to love. And Leia would sit in the front row, healthy and whole, and glowing with the confidence of a child who knows she's heard. Sometimes people would ask her questions after Jason spoke, and her answers carried wisdom that made grown-ups stop and think. How did you forgive your daddy? A mother once asked. Leia considered this with her characteristic seriousness. He was scared, she said finally. Sometimes when people are scared, they forget how to love right. But that doesn't mean they don't. Love, it just means they need help remembering. Besides, she added with a smile that could light up the darkest room, forgiveness isn't for them, it's for us. It's how we make space for new love to grow. Out of the mouths of babes, as Mary would say later, shaking her head in amazement at the profundity that could emerge from an 8-year-old's understanding of the world. The following spring, they planted more sunflowers. And the spring after that, each year, the garden grew larger, more beautiful, more hopeful. Neighbors began to stop and admire the bright faces turning toward the sun, and some of them shared their own stories of pain ignored, of healing delayed, of love that had to learn new ways to express itself. The garden became a gathering place, a symbol of something larger than one family's journey through darkness into light. Children played among the tall stalks while parents sat on the porch Jason had built, sharing stories and sweet tea and the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving what you thought might destroy you. Dr. Chun visited sometimes, marveling at the transformation, not just in Leia's medical charts, but in the girl herself. The quiet, pain-shadowed child who'd first come to her office had become a vibrant young woman who spoke up for herself and others, who understood that strength came, in many forms, who knew the difference between enduring pain and honoring it. You know what I think? Dr. Chun said one afternoon, watching Leah demonstrate proper sunflower planting technique to a group of younger children. I think she's going to be a doctor someday, or a teacher, or maybe just someone who knows how to listen when people hurt. Jason smiled, watching his daughter, his miracle, his teacher, his greatest blessing. She's already all of those things. As the years passed, the story took on a life of its own. Teachers shared it in staff meetings, reminding each other to pay attention to the quiet signs, the subtle changes that might signal a child in distress. Parents whispered it in playgroups and school pickup lines, a reminder that strength isn't always loud. That love sometimes means admitting you don't have all the answers. Medical professionals used it in training, helping new doctors and nurses understand that healing happens. In relationship, that listening is sometimes the most powerful medicine they can offer. But the most important audience was always the children themselves. Because children who hear this story learn something vital. Their voices matter. Their pain deserves attention. Their need for help is not weakness, but humanity. They learn that adults make mistakes, but love can learn new ways to express itself. They learn that forgiveness is possible, that healing happens in community, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you need help. Years later, when Leah was in high school and the tumor was a distant memory, she wrote an essay. For her English class about the day, her teacher looked at her belly and called 911. She called it, "The day my voice found its strength." Pain taught me to speak, she wrote in her conclusion. Fear taught my father to listen. Love taught us both that we were stronger together than apart. And sunflowers taught us that no matter how deep the roots, no matter how dark the soil, we can always turn our faces toward the light. She got an A on that essay. But more importantly, she got something rarer, the knowledge that her story mattered, that her pain had purpose, that her healing had become a gift she could offer to others walking similar paths. Sound of wind through sunflower stalks. The garden still grows, year after year. Jason tends it now with hands that have learned gentleness, while Mary sits on the porch offering wisdom to anyone who needs it. Emily visits regularly, bringing new children to see the flowers and hear the story of how pain can become purpose, how fear can become freedom, how love can learn new ways to flourish. And Leah? Leah is in medical school now, studying to become a pediatric surgeon. She wants to be the kind of doctor who listens not just to symptoms, but to stories, who understands that healing happens as much in the heart as in the body, grows very soft, intimate as a prayer. She carries her scar with pride, that thin pink line that reminds her daily that she survived what could have destroyed her. More than survived, she flourished. Like the sunflowers in her father's garden. She learned to turn her face toward the light, no matter how dark the soil beneath her feet. Long pause, and sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sunflowers nod heavy with seeds and the air smells like possibility, Jason stands in that garden and remembers the man he used to be. The man who thought strength meant silence, who confused love with demands for toughness, who nearly lost everything because he was afraid to admit he didn't have all the answers. Voice thick with gratitude, he thinks about Emily Hayes, who saw what others missed and had the courage to act. About Dr. Chun, who healed with both skill and compassion. About Mary, who loved through the storm and emerged with her faith stronger than ever. But mostly, he thinks about Leah, about the 8-year-old girl who taught him that forgiveness is possible. That strength comes in many forms, that love doesn't require perfection. It only requires presence. So tell me, friend, what's the pain you've been ignoring? What's the voice you haven't been hearing? What's the seed of healing waiting to be planted in the dark soil of your own heart? Long pause, because somewhere, in a garden full of sunflowers, a family learned that the strongest roots grow in the richest darkness, that the brightest blooms come from seeds planted in soil mixed with tears. That's sometimes the most beautiful thing you can do is turn your face toward the light and trust that growth is possible, especially when you can't see it happening. Sound of wind carrying sunflower seeds to new ground. The sunflowers scatter their seeds each fall, trusting the wind to carry them where they need to go. Some will find good soil and grow tall. Others might struggle or fail to take root. But that's not the point. The point is the trying, the reaching, the turning toward light even when darkness seems to have the stronger claim. Voice becomes a whisper, then fades, and in gardens all over the world, in hearts that have learned to listen, in families that have discovered new ways to love, the sunflowers keep growing, keep turning, keep reaching for the light. Silence. Then, very softly, that's how healing happens, friend. One seed at a time, one story at a time, one moment of courage at a time. Final pause. Now go plant your own sunflowers. The world is waiting to see what beauty grows from your willingness to turn toward the light. As the years passed, the story took on a life of its own. Teachers shared it in staff meetings, reminding each other to pay attention to the quiet signs, the subtle changes that might signal a child in distress. Parents whispered it in playgroups and school pickup lines, a reminder that strength isn't always loud. That love sometimes means admitting you don't have all the answers. Medical professionals used it in training, helping new doctors and nurses understand that healing happens. In relationship, that listening is sometimes the most powerful medicine they can offer. But the most important audience was always the children themselves. Because children who hear this story learn something vital. Their voices matter. Their pain deserves attention. Their need for help is not weakness, but humanity. They learn that adults make mistakes, but love can learn new ways to express itself. They learn that forgiveness is possible, that healing happens in community, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you need help. Years later, when Leah was in high school and the tumor was a distant memory, she wrote an essay. For her English class about the day, her teacher looked at her belly and called 911. She called it, "The day my voice found its strength." Pain taught me to speak, she wrote in her conclusion. Fear taught my father to listen. Love taught us both that we were stronger together than apart. And sunflowers taught us that no matter how deep the roots, no matter how dark the soil, we can always turn our faces toward the light. She got an A on that essay. But more importantly, she got something rarer, the knowledge that her story mattered, that her pain had purpose, that her healing had become a gift she could offer to others walking similar paths. Sound of wind through sunflower stalks. The garden still grows, year after year. Jason tends it now with hands that have learned gentleness, while Mary sits on the porch offering wisdom to anyone who needs it. Emily visits regularly, bringing new children to see the flowers and hear the story of how pain can become purpose, how fear can become freedom, how love can learn new ways to flourish. And Leah? Leah is in medical school now, studying to become a pediatric surgeon. She wants to be the kind of doctor who listens not just to symptoms, but to stories, who understands that healing happens as much in the heart as in the body, grows very soft, intimate as a prayer. She carries her scar with pride, that thin pink line that reminds her daily that she survived what could have destroyed her. More than survived, she flourished. Like the sunflowers in her father's garden, she learned to turn her face toward the light, no matter how dark the soil beneath her feet. Long pause, and sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the sunflowers nod heavy with seeds and the air smells like possibility, Jason stands in that garden and remembers the man he used to be. The man who thought strength meant silence, who confused love with demands for toughness, who nearly lost everything because he was afraid to admit he didn't have all the answers. Voice thick with gratitude, he thinks about Emily Hayes, who saw what others missed and had the courage to act. About Dr. Chun, who healed with both skill and compassion. About Mary, who loved through the storm and emerged with her faith stronger than ever. But mostly, he thinks about Leah, about the 8-year-old girl who taught him that forgiveness is possible. That strength comes in many forms, that love doesn't require perfection. It only requires presence. So tell me, friend, what's the pain you've been ignoring? What's the voice you haven't been hearing? What's the seed of healing waiting to be planted in the dark soil of your own heart? Long pause, because somewhere, in a garden full of sunflowers, a family learned that the strongest roots grow in the richest darkness, that the brightest blooms come from seeds planted in soil mixed with tears. That sometimes the most beautiful thing you can do is turn your face toward the light and trust that growth is possible, even when, especially when you can't see it happening. Sound of wind carrying sunflower seeds to new ground. The sunflowers scatter their seeds each fall, trusting the wind to carry them where they need to go. Some will find good soil and grow tall. Others might struggle or fail to take root. But that's not the point. The point is the trying, the reaching, the turning toward light, even when darkness seems to have the stronger claim. Voice becomes a whisper, then fades, and in gardens all over the world, in hearts that have learned to listen, in families that have discovered new ways to love, the sunflowers keep growing, keep turning, keep reaching for the light. Silence. Then, very softly, that's how healing happens, friend. One seed at a time, one story at a time, one moment of courage at a time. Final pause. Now go plant your own sunflowers. The world is waiting to see what beauty grows from your willingness to turn toward the light. As the years passed, the story took on a life of its own. Teachers shared it in staff meetings, reminding each other to pay attention to the quiet signs, the subtle changes that might signal a child in distress. Parents whispered it in playgroups and school pickup lines, a reminder that strength isn't always loud. That love sometimes means admitting you don't have all the answers. Medical professionals used it in training, helping new doctors and nurses understand that healing happens. In relationship, that listening is sometimes the most powerful medicine they can offer. But the most important audience was always the children themselves. Because children who hear this story learn something vital. Their voices matter. Their pain deserves attention. Their need for help is not weakness, but humanity. They learn that adults make mistakes, but love can learn new ways to express itself. They learn that forgiveness is possible, that healing happens in community, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you need help. Years later, when Leah was in high school and the tumor was a distant memory, she wrote an essay. For her English class about the day, her teacher looked at her belly and called 911. She called it, "The day my voice found its strength." Pain taught me to speak, she wrote in her conclusion. Fear taught my father to listen. Love taught us both that we were stronger together than apart. And sunflowers taught us that no matter how deep the roots, no matter how dark the soil, we can always turn our faces toward the light. She got an A on that essay. But more importantly, she got something rarer, the knowledge that her story mattered, that her pain had purpose, that her healing had become a gift she could offer to others walking similar paths. Sound of wind through sunflower stalks. The garden still grows, year after year. Jason tends it now with hands that have learned gentleness, while Mary sits on the porch offering wisdom to anyone who needs it. Emily visits regularly, bringing new children to see the flowers and hear the story of how pain can become purpose, how fear can become freedom, how love can learn new ways to flourish. And Leah? Leah is in medical school now, studying to become a pediatric surgeon. She wants to be the kind of doctor who listens not just to symptoms, but to stories, who understands that healing happens as much in the heart as in the body, grows very soft, intimate as a prayer. She carries her scar with pride, that thin pink line that reminds her daily that she survived what could have destroyed her. More than survived, she flourished. Like the sunflowers in her father's garden, she learned to turn her face toward the light, no matter how dark the soil beneath her feet. Long pause, and sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sunflowers nod heavy with seeds and the air smells like possibility, Jason stands in that garden and remembers the man he used to be. A man who thought strength meant silence, who confused love with demands for toughness, who nearly lost everything because he was afraid to admit he didn't have all the answers. Voice thick with gratitude, he thinks about Emily Hayes, who saw what others missed and had the courage to act. About Dr. Chun, who healed with both skill and compassion. About Mary, who loved through the storm and emerged with her faith stronger than ever. But mostly,